I was sitting in my private study on the 42nd floor of the Morgan Tower in downtown Manhattan, the early October dusk filtering through the tall windows of my penthouse. The fading light cast long shadows across my mahogany desk, illuminating the stack of contracts I'd been reviewing for the past 3 hours. Outside, New York City was transforming into its nocturnal form, a tapestry of twinkling lights against the darkening sky. My fingers traced the rim of a crystal tumbler, half filled with Macallan 25, a small indulgence after a day of negotiations and board meetings at Peterson Global Ventures. In that quiet moment, with only the soft hum of the city below and the occasional car horn rising up from Fifth Avenue, I heard the unmistakable sound of my phone ringing. The screen lit up with a name I hadn't expected, Tyler, my 14-year-old son. I answered without suspecting the twist this call would soon bring to my carefully ordered life. "Dad?" The line connected, and I could immediately sense a youthful, excited energy on the other end. "Hey, kiddo. Everything okay?" I asked, leaning back in my leather chair, relieved to hear from him. Our conversations had grown increasingly sparse since he'd started high school and since the divorce had finalized 2 years ago. What came next changed everything. In the background of the call, I could hear Tyler's voice, brimming with pride and mischief, as he announced to someone else, "My dad is rich and single." The words echoed in my ears, sending a sudden jolt of disbelief mixed with amusement. For a moment, I choked on the remnants of my drink, the unexpected comment catching me completely off guard. "Tyler? Who are you talking to?" I managed to ask between coughs. "Oh, shoot. Dad, I didn't mean to call you," he stammered, the panic in his voice palpable. Were you trying to set me up with someone?" I asked, my initial shock giving way to curiosity. The line went quiet for a beat before Tyler responded, his voice smaller now. "Maybe? Ms. Ramirez was asking about you, and I kind of." "Dad, don't be mad." Ms. Ramirez. The name triggered a cascade of memories. Elena Ramirez, Tyler's art teacher from last semester. I remembered meeting her briefly at a parent-teacher conference, a woman with striking dark eyes and an easy laugh who had praised Tyler's creativity with genuine enthusiasm. As laughter bubbled up from deep within, I struggled to regain my composure. It was as if time had slowed down, and every second magnified the surreal nature of the conversation. I knew there was more to this call than my son's simple declaration, but I couldn't yet fathom how it would change everything I thought I knew about my life. "I'm not mad, Tyler," I assured him, still processing what was happening. "But maybe next time you want to play matchmaker, give your old man heads up first?" "So, you're not upset?" he asked cautiously. "No, but I am curious. Why Ms. Ramirez? And why now?" Tyler sighed, the sound of a teenager preparing to confess. "You've been alone since you and Mom split up. All you do is work. Even when I'm at your place for the weekend, you're locked in your study half the time." His words struck a nerve. I glanced around my expansive study, suddenly aware of its emptiness despite the expensive furnishings and art pieces that adorned the walls. When had my son become so perceptive? "And Ms. Ramirez is really cool," Tyler continued. "She asked about you after she saw you drop me off last week. She remembers you from the conference." "Does she now?" I couldn't help the small smile that formed on my lips. It had been a long time since anyone had asked about me for reasons unrelated to business or finances. "She's single too," Tyler added quickly, capitalizing on what he clearly perceived as interest on my part. "And she likes that weird jazz stuff you're always listening to." "It's not weird, it's classic," I corrected automatically, my mind already drifting to the possibility of meeting Elena Ramirez under different circumstances. Would it be inappropriate? Probably. Was I intrigued? Absolutely. Whatever. Anyway, I gotta go. We're still on for Saturday, right? You promised to take me to the Mets game. Of course, I replied, making a mental note to clear my schedule. These days, promises to Tyler took precedence over everything else. "I've got the tickets already." "Awesome. Later, Dad." And with that, he was gone, the line disconnecting before I could ask any more questions. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring out at the New York skyline as twilight deepened into night. Something about that brief conversation had shaken loose feelings I'd kept buried for too long, not just about dating again, but about the kind of father I'd become. Daniel Peterson, billionaire CEO of Peterson Global Ventures, known in business circles as the Wolf of Wall Street's better-dressed cousin. That was the persona I'd cultivated since the divorce, throwing myself into work with a vengeance that had doubled my company's value but halved my time with my son. And now Tyler, in his adolescent wisdom, had decided it was time for me to move on. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. Was I ready? The question hung in the air as I swirled the remaining whiskey in my glass. My phone buzzed with a text notification. It was from Tyler. By the way, she's chaperoning the field trip to MoMA next Friday. Just saying. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing in the vast space of my study. My son, the matchmaker. Who would have thought? As I stood to refresh my drink, I caught my reflection in the window, a man in his early 40s, graying slightly at the temples, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent. Behind the successful exterior, I saw something I hadn't noticed in a long time, a spark of anticipation in my eyes. Maybe it was time to step out of this carefully constructed world I'd built since Jennifer left. Maybe it was time to remember there was more to life than quarterly reports and merger negotiations. Maybe, just maybe, my son's accidental call was exactly what I needed. I made a mental note to look into chaperoning that MoMA field trip next Friday. After Tyler's call ended, I found myself unable to focus on the contracts that had seemed so urgent just minutes before. I set aside the work and poured another finger of Macallan, this time carrying it to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. The city lights blurred slightly as memories of Jennifer, not my ex-wife as many assumed, but my late wife, and the days before our paths diverged rushed back in vivid detail. Tyler's voice, laced with innocent enthusiasm, had triggered something deep within me. With each word, I found myself confronting painful yet cherished moments of a past life I had long tried to set aside. That night, the mixture of nostalgia and regret made me pause and reflect on the choices that led me here. Jennifer and I had met at Columbia, both ambitious students with clear visions of our futures. She was studying literature with dreams of becoming an editor at a prestigious publishing house. I was pursuing my MBA, determined to build my father's modest investment firm into something greater. We married young, against the advice of our parents, convinced our love could withstand the pressures of our career aspirations. For a while, it did. I remembered our first apartment in Brooklyn Heights, a cramped one-bedroom with questionable heating, but a view of the Manhattan skyline that made up for all its flaws. We'd sit on our tiny balcony drinking cheap wine, dreaming about our future as we watched the sun set behind the towers across the East River. Tyler came along earlier than we'd planned, but Jennifer took to motherhood with the same passionate dedication she brought to everything in life. I remembered how she would read to him even as a newborn, convinced that Dickens and Austen would seep into his subconscious and give him an appreciation for literature. I closed my eyes, letting the memory of her voice wash over me. The soft cadence of her words as she read Great Expectations to our infant son, the gentle way she'd correct my pronunciation of French dishes when I tried to impress her with my cooking, the firm tone she used when I worked too late and missed Tyler's bedtime. Daniel, he won't remember if you miss one merger meeting, but he'll remember if you miss his 5th birthday. She had been right, of course. She usually was about the things that truly mattered. I remembered the laughter we once shared as a family, the small moments of everyday joy that were all too fleeting. Tyler's first steps across our living room floor, his little hands reaching for mine. The family vacations to my grandfather's cabin in the Adirondacks, where cell service was mercifully non-existent. Jennifer teaching Tyler to fish in the small lake while I pretended to read, but actually watched them both, storing away the image of their matching concentrated expressions as they waited for a bite. The familiar cadence of my son's tone reminded me of happier times when our little world was whole. Yet, those recollections were intermingled with the sharp sting of loss and the heavy burden of solitary decisions that followed. The diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer, came when Tyler was only 7. The doctors gave Jennifer 6 months. She fought for 18, determined to see Tyler's 9th birthday. I took another sip of whiskey, feeling the burn in my throat that matched the ache in my chest. The last conversation Jennifer and I had before she slipped into a coma played in my mind with painful clarity. "Promise me something, Daniel," she had whispered, her once vibrant voice now threadbare. "Anything," I'd replied, meaning it more than any vow I'd ever made. "Don't hide behind your work. Don't use it to run from grief." Her eyes, still beautiful despite the illness that had ravaged her body, had held mine with intensity. "And don't let Tyler forget that life is meant to be lived, not just survived." I had promised, of course. But keeping that promise proved harder than I could have imagined. After the funeral, I found that the only way I could function was to compartmentalize. Work became my sanctuary, a place where decisions had clear metrics for success, where problems had solutions that could be implemented and measured. Peterson Global Ventures grew exponentially under my relentless focus. I became known for strategic acquisitions that seemed uncanny in their timing, for work hours that would break most people, for a ruthless efficiency in business matters that earned me both respect and fear in equal measure. Meanwhile, at home, I hired the best nannies money could buy for Tyler, convinced I was providing stability through financial security. When he was old enough, I enrolled him in Browning, the prestigious private school on the Upper East Side, where he could receive an education worthy of his potential. I was a billionaire CEO, yes, but the weight of my personal sacrifices made that status seem hollow on nights like this, when the truth of my failures as a father and as the man Jennifer had loved became impossible to ignore. Tyler's words from the phone call echoed in my mind. "All you do is work. Even when I'm at your place for the weekend, you're locked in your study half the time." He was right. Somewhere along the way, I had broken my promise to Jennifer. I had hidden behind my work, used it as a shield against the pain of loss, and in doing so, I had missed crucial years of Tyler's childhood. Every syllable from the phone carried an unintended reminder of what was lost and what might still be salvaged. I began to wonder if, somewhere in the cascade of emotions, this call was meant to steer me back toward a long-forgotten part of myself. In that instant, I felt the first stirring of a transformation that I had never anticipated. The idea of meeting Elena Ramirez wasn't just about potential romance. It represented something more fundamental, a chance to step back into the world of the living, to engage with life in a way I hadn't since Jennifer's death. Maybe this was the opportunity to fulfill my promise, to show Tyler that I remembered how to live, not just survive. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Tyler. "Found a picture of you smiling once. Thought you might need a reminder of what your face can do when it's not being all COI." Attached was a photo I hadn't seen in years. Jennifer, Tyler, and me at Coney Island. Tyler couldn't have been more than 6, his face covered in cotton candy, Jennifer laughing as I tried to wipe it off while the cyclone roller coaster loomed in the background. We all looked happy, carefree in a way that seemed foreign to me now. I saved the photo, mentally adding it to the collection of memories that defined who I was beyond the boardroom. Perhaps it was time to honor Jennifer's memory not by working myself into oblivion, but by embracing the life she would have wanted for both Tyler and me. Tomorrow, I decided I would call the school and offer to chaperone that MoMA field trip. It was time to start keeping my promises. I woke the next morning with unusual clarity, my decision to chaperone the MoMA field trip still firm in my mind. After my usual morning routine, a punishing session with my personal trainer in the building's gym, followed by a protein shake and a briefing from my assistant, Rebecca, about the day's schedule, I found myself with the rare privilege of a 15-minute gap between meetings. It was just enough time to make the call. "Browning School, how may I help you?" The receptionist's voice was crisp and professional. "This is Daniel Peterson, Tyler Peterson's father. I'd like to speak with someone about volunteering as a chaperone for the upcoming field trip to MoMA." There was a slight pause before the receptionist responded. "Oh, Mr. Peterson. Of course. Let me transfer you to Mrs. Winters, our community engagement coordinator." As I waited on hold, I glanced at the framed photo on my desk, one of the few personal touches in my otherwise minimalist office. It showed Tyler at his middle school graduation, his smile broad, but his eyes carrying a hint of sadness I hadn't noticed at the time. Had he missed his mother that day? had my presence been enough? Mr. Peterson? A woman's voice interrupted my thoughts. This is Margaret Winters. I understand you're interested in chaperoning the MoMA trip next Friday. That's right, I confirmed, suddenly feeling oddly nervous, as if I were asking someone on a date. In a way, perhaps I was. My son mentioned it, and I thought it might be a good opportunity to be more involved. Well, this is certainly unexpected, Mrs. Winters said, not unkindly. We're always happy to have parent volunteers, especially for the more cultural outings. The students will be visiting the new exhibition on American modernism, and we could certainly use additional supervision. Great, I said, a strange sense of accomplishment washing over me. When was the last time I'd done something this spontaneous? What do I need to do? I'll email you the necessary forms. We'll need a background check, though I imagine that won't be an issue for someone of your profile. I smiled at her careful phrasing. My profile was indeed well documented in both the financial press and the society pages of the New York Times. Not a problem. And who will be leading the trip? I asked, trying to sound casual. The art department faculty, primarily. Ms. Ramirez is coordinating, with assistance from Mr. Grant and Ms. Chen. I felt a small thrill at the confirmation of Elena's involvement. Excellent. I look forward to receiving those forms. After ending the call, I sat back in my chair, half expecting to feel foolish for this impulsive decision. Instead, I felt lighter somehow, as if I'd shed a small portion of the armor I'd constructed around myself over the years. The rest of the day passed in a blur of meetings, calls, and decisions that would impact thousands of employees and millions in capital. By evening, I found myself back in my penthouse, the forms for the field trip already completed and sent back to Mrs. Winters. I'd even received a confirmation email, along with a detailed itinerary for the day. Tyler was due to arrive the next morning for our weekend together, and for once, I'd cleared my schedule entirely. The Mets game on Saturday, perhaps a bike ride through Central Park on Sunday, I was determined to be present in a way I hadn't been in years. As I settled into my study with a glass of wine, my phone rang. An unknown number. Typically, I'd let it go to voicemail. Few people had my direct line, and unexpected calls usually meant unwelcome solicitations. But something prompted me to answer. Daniel Peterson speaking. Mr. Peterson? A woman's voice, warm with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. This is Elena Ramirez from Browning School. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. My heartbeat quickened unexpectedly. Not at all, Ms. Ramirez. What can I do for you? I just wanted to thank you personally for volunteering for the MoMA trip. We rarely get parents with your schedule constraints offering to chaperone, and I know Tyler will be thrilled. As I listened more intently, the realization of who was really behind this call sent a cold shiver down my spine. It wasn't just a matter of a teacher reaching out to a parent. There was something in her tone, a hint of familiarity that caught me off guard. Please, call me Daniel, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. And it's my pleasure. I've been meaning to be more involved in Tyler's school activities. That's wonderful to hear, Elena replied, and I could hear the smile in her voice. Tyler speaks very highly of you, you know. He's quite proud of his father. That's surprising to hear, honestly. The admission came before I could filter it. There was a brief pause before Elena continued, her voice softening. Children see more than we give them credit for. Tyler understands how hard you work to provide for him. I swallowed hard, unaccustomed to this kind of conversation. I appreciate you saying that. I haven't always been as present as I should be. It's never too late to change that, she offered gently. Then, with a slight shift in tone, she added, Tyler mentioned that you're a fan of jazz? The sudden change of subject threw me momentarily. Yes, I am. How did that come up? Elena laughed, the sound unexpectedly rich and genuine. He was very eager to tell me about your extensive vinyl collection when I mentioned I'd seen Terence Blanchard perform last month. I could almost hear the cautious tone in her voice, a hint of vulnerability hidden behind confident words. This wasn't just a professional call about a field trip. This was something more personal. That moment of realization paralyzed me. I recognized the subtext. Elena Ramirez wasn't just Tyler's art teacher reaching out about a school event. This was someone who had, whether intentionally or not, entered my orbit in a way few had since Jennifer's death. The knowledge that my son had been engaging in what amounted to matchmaking was both thrilling and terrifying. My heart pounded in a way that felt both foreign and familiar, the mix of shock and hidden desire overwhelming my senses. The jazz standard has a good lineup next month, I heard myself saying. If you're interested in live performances. I've heard it's excellent, she replied. I haven't been yet. The opening was clear, yet I hesitated, suddenly aware of the complexity of the situation. She was Tyler's teacher. I was a parent at her school. The potential for complications was significant. Perhaps we could discuss it further at the museum next week, I suggested, opting for caution. I'd like that, Elena said, and I detected no disappointment in her tone, only patient understanding. I should let you go now. I'm sure you're busy. Less busy than usual, I admitted. Tyler will be here tomorrow for the weekend. Enjoy your time with him, she said warmly. He's a special young man. After we said our goodbyes, I sat there in silence, grappling with conflicting emotions. The initial amusement at Tyler's matchmaking had faded, replaced by a deep, gnawing tension. I realized that something fundamental was shifting, that the careful boundaries I'd established between my personal and professional lives, between my past and present, were beginning to blur. I realized that the truth of my past, my grief, my withdrawal, my failure to fully engage with life after Jennifer's death, was seeping into the present, and that every secret, no matter how well hidden, has a way of resurfacing when least expected. It was the kind of moment that would forever redefine my understanding of love, loss, and the intricate ties of fate. As I stared out at the Manhattan skyline, lights twinkling like earthbound stars, I wondered what Jennifer would think of all this. Would she approve of Elena? Would she be disappointed in how I'd handled the years since her death? Or would she simply be relieved that I was finally making an effort to emerge from the shell I'd constructed around myself? I had no answers, only questions, and the unsettling sense that I was standing on the edge of something both frightening and necessary. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler. Dad, can we go to that brunch place near your building tomorrow? The one with the awesome waffles. I smiled, typing back, absolutely. See you at 10. Tomorrow would bring Tyler, and next Friday would bring the field trip and more time with Elena Ramirez. For the first time in years, I found myself looking forward to something other than closing a deal. The weekend with Tyler was a revelation. I'd forgotten how much energy a 14-year-old boy could possess, how his enthusiasm could transform even the most mundane activities into adventures. We ate waffles drowning in syrup at Sarah Beth's, cheered ourselves hoarse at the Mets game. They lost, but Tyler declared it the best game ever, anyway, and spent Sunday morning cycling through Central Park, racing each other around the reservoir and stopping for hot dogs from a vendor near Bethesda Fountain. It was during a quiet moment on Sunday afternoon, as we sat on a bench watching model boats glide across the conservatory water, that Tyler broached the subject. "Did Ms. Ramirez call you?" he asked, his eyes fixed on a miniature sailboat cutting through the water. I considered deflecting, but opted for honesty. She did. About the field trip. Tyler glanced at me, a mischievous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Just about the field trip? Mostly, I admitted. Though she did mention your enthusiasm in telling her about my jazz collection. His cheeks reddened slightly, but he didn't look away. She likes jazz too. I thought it was a good conversation starter. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders, surprised when he didn't immediately shrug it off as he'd been doing lately. Tyler, are you sure you're okay with this? With me potentially being interested in someone? He was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. Mom's been gone a long time, Dad. And she wouldn't want you to be alone forever. He paused, kicking at a pebble near his foot. Besides, Ms. Ramirez is cool. She doesn't treat us like we're stupid just because we're kids. The simplicity of his reasoning hit me with unexpected force. Out of the mouths of babes, as the saying goes. I squeezed his shoulder gently. Thank you, buddy. That means a lot. The days that followed were a blur of introspection and subtle confrontation with my own habits. I found myself questioning every decision I had made and every wall I had built around my heart since Jennifer's death. Every quiet moment was now punctuated by memories of that phone call with Elena, the echo of her warm laughter, a constant reminder of possibilities I'd long denied myself. By Tuesday, I'd done something unprecedented. I delegated a major acquisition negotiation to my COO, Richard Barnes. When his eyebrows shot up in surprise during our morning briefing, I simply said, "You've been ready to take the lead on this for months. I trust your judgment." The truth was more complicated. I needed mental space to process the shifting landscape of my personal life, something I hadn't prioritized in years. Wednesday brought an unexpected email from Elena, ostensibly about the logistics for Friday's field trip, but ending with a personal note, looking forward to discussing jazz and other mutual interests. The museum cafe makes an excellent espresso if you're inclined to stay after we herd the students back to school. I read those lines perhaps a dozen times, analyzing them as carefully as any merger proposal. Was this a professional courtesy or a personal invitation? The uncertainty was both exhilarating and terrifying. I immersed myself in work as a way to distract my mind, but even the boardroom couldn't shield me from the spiraling thoughts of what lay ahead. Late nights were filled with restless pacing in my penthouse and endless reflections on the nature of trust and forgiveness, not just from others, but from myself. I knew that Tyler's innocent comment about me being rich and single was just the spark that ignited a chain of revelations, ones that I had long feared might be my undoing. By Thursday evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years, visiting Jennifer's grave at Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. The magnificent Victorian necropolis was quiet in the fading light, the ornate monuments and mausoleums casting long shadows across the winding paths. Jennifer's headstone was simple by comparison to many of its neighbors, an elegant granite marker with her name, dates, and the inscription she had chosen herself, "Love is the only gold," a line from Tennyson, one of her favorite poets. I stood there, hands in the pockets of my overcoat, the October wind rustling through the trees overhead. "I think I'm ready," I said quietly, feeling both foolish and relieved to be speaking aloud. To try again, to be present for Tyler in the way he deserves, to maybe let someone new into our lives. I paused, swallowing against the tightness in my throat. "I hope that's okay with you." No divine sign appeared, no sudden break in the clouds, no symbolic bird landing nearby. Just the continued whisper of the wind and the distant sounds of Brooklyn traffic. But I felt a weight lift, as if the very act of articulating these thoughts had granted me permission to move forward. On the Uber ride back to Manhattan, my phone pinged with a text from Tyler. "Good luck tomorrow. Don't wear one of your scary suits. It's an art museum, not a hostile takeover." I laughed out loud, startling the driver who glanced at me in the rearview mirror. I texted back, "No suits. Promise. How's the history project coming?" His response was immediate, boring. "Who cares about the War of 1812? The Canadians," I replied. "They won." "Dad joke alert," came his response, followed by an eye-rolling emoji. I smiled, a sense of normality washing over me. Whatever happened tomorrow with Elena, this newfound connection with my son was worth preserving and nurturing. Friday morning dawned clear and crisp, a perfect New York autumn day. I dressed carefully in dark jeans, a navy cashmere sweater, and a charcoal blazer, casual enough for an art museum, but still put together. As I adjusted my collar in the mirror, I realized I was nervous in a way I hadn't experienced since my first dates with Jennifer more than 20 years ago. Every conversation with my closest advisors that morning, every decision in the office, seemed to echo with a deeper significance. I was no longer just a CEO or a widower. I was a man at the crossroads of a life where every step forward felt momentous. The pressure of living what felt like a double life became palpable as I prepared to face not just the external consequences of my choices, but the internal reckoning of who I truly was and who I wanted to become. By noon, I was signing in at the Browning School's front desk, accepting a visitor's badge from a receptionist who couldn't quite hide her surprise at seeing the notorious workaholic Daniel Peterson taking time off for a school field trip. The The students are gathering in the main hall, she informed me, gesturing down a corridor lined with student artwork. I followed her directions, my footsteps echoing on the polished floors. The hallway opened into a large atrium where groups of students were already forming, their excited voices bouncing off the high ceiling. Faculty members moved among them, checking names off lists and issuing last-minute instructions. And then I saw her, Elena Ramirez, clipboard in hand, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a burgundy dress with a geometric patterned scarf. She was speaking animatedly to a small group of students, her free hand gesturing to emphasize whatever point she was making. As if sensing my presence, she looked up, her eyes meeting mine across the crowded space. Her smile, warm and genuine, sent an unexpected jolt through me. This, I realized, was the moment that would define the next chapter of my life. The day when Daniel Peterson, the man who had hidden behind boardroom walls and billion-dollar deals, would finally step back into the messy, unpredictable, wonderful world of human connection. I took a deep breath and walked toward her, ready to embrace whatever came next. The MoMA field trip unfolded in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Initially, I found myself assigned to supervise a group that didn't include Tyler, a deliberate choice on Elena's part, I suspected, to avoid any appearance of favoritism. My group of 5 sophomore boys regarded me with a mixture of awe and suspicion, clearly aware of who I was, but uncertain how to interact with a parent who was also a recognizable figure from the business pages of the New York Times. "You're Tyler's dad, right?" one lanky boy asked as we moved through the American Modernism exhibition. "The one who owns like half of Manhattan?" "Just a very small fraction," I corrected with a smile. "And yes, I'm Tyler's father." "Cool," the boy replied, his attention already drifting to a large Pollock canvas. Throughout the morning, I caught glimpses of Elena leading her own group, her expressions animated as she explained the significance of various works. Occasionally, our eyes would meet across a gallery, and she would offer a small smile or nod before returning to her students. Tyler, I noticed, was watching these exchanges with poorly concealed interest, nudging his friends whenever he caught us looking at each other. It wasn't until the scheduled lunch break, when the students were released to the museum's cafe with strict instructions to remain there, that Elena and I finally had a moment to speak. "Enjoying your foray into the world of adolescent art appreciation?" she asked, joining me at a small table near the edge of the cafe. "More than I expected," I admitted, "though I'm not sure I've convinced them that I'm more than just Tyler's rich dad." She laughed, the sound genuine and unrestrained. "Give them time. Teenagers are simultaneously the most judgmental and open-minded creatures on the planet." "Tyler seems to think highly of you," I said, watching her carefully. "He doesn't usually connect with his teachers this way." Her expression softened. "Tyler is special. He has an artist's sensitivity combined with an engineer's analytical mind. It's an unusual combination." "That sounds like his mother," I said before I could stop myself. An awkward silence fell between us. I hadn't meant to bring Jennifer into the conversation so quickly, but perhaps it was inevitable. Elena regarded me steadily. "Tyler has mentioned her. He said she was a book editor." "She was," I confirmed, my throat tightening slightly. "At Scribner. She loved discovering new voices, helping shape raw talent into something refined." "I'm sorry for your loss," Elena said quietly. "Tyler told me it was cancer." I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When I found my voice again, I said, "It's been 7 years. Tyler was only 7 when she died. That's a difficult age to lose a parent." Elena's voice carried the weight of someone who understood loss firsthand. "Young enough to still be forming core memories, old enough to fully comprehend what's happening. You sound like you have experience with this," I observed. She hesitated, then said, "My father died when I was 9. Heart attack. One day he was there, teaching me to ride a bike in Riverside Park. The next day, gone." The cafe buzzed with teenage energy around us, but in that moment, it felt as if we existed in a bubble of shared understanding. "How did your mother handle it?" I asked, genuinely curious about how other families navigated the terrain I'd struggled with for years. She went back to work almost immediately. She's a nurse at New York Presbyterian. I think taking care of others was how she processed her own grief. Elena paused, tracing the rim of her coffee cup. She never remarried. Said my father was her one great love. I understand that feeling, I admitted. For a long time, I couldn't imagine being with anyone after Jennifer. Our eyes met, and the unspoken question hung between us. And now? The moment was interrupted by a museum staff member informing us that our scheduled time in the special exhibition was about to begin. As we gathered our respective student groups, Elena whispered, "Meet me in the sculpture garden after we get the kids back on the bus." "Around 4?" I nodded, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness settling in my chest. The remainder of the museum visit passed in a blur of paintings, sculptures, and teenage commentary that ranged from surprisingly insightful to comically dismissive. By the time we herded the students back onto the chartered buses, the afternoon sun was casting long shadows across Fifth Avenue. After confirming that Tyler had a ride home with a friend's family for their weekend plans, I found myself with no excuse not to keep my appointment with Elena. One stormy evening, the time for evasions was over. The sculpture garden was relatively quiet, most of the day's visitors having moved on to other parts of the museum. Elena was already there, seated on a bench near a large bronze piece, her scarf fluttering slightly in the autumn breeze. As I approached, I felt a strange sense of inevitability, as if all paths in my life had been leading to this moment. I reached out to the person from my past, compelled by the realization that avoidance was no longer an option. As we met in the secluded, art-filled space, every unspoken word and long-buried emotion surged to the surface. I found myself staring into her eyes, where curiosity and caution mingled in equal measure, and I knew that our encounter was both inevitable and necessary. "Thank you for suggesting this," I said, taking a seat beside her. "It's been a long time since I visited a museum just for the enjoyment of it." "Work keeps you that busy?" she asked, turning slightly to face me. "Work has been my refuge," I admitted. After Jennifer died, I threw myself into building the company. It was the one area of my life where I felt some sense of control. Elena nodded, understanding in her eyes. "And Tyler?" I exhaled slowly, the weight of my shortcomings as a father settling heavily on my shoulders. I provided for him materially, the best schools, the best opportunities. But emotionally, I've been absent in ways I'm only now beginning to recognize. The conversation that unfolded was raw and unfiltered. I confessed the burden of my grief and the loneliness that had defined my existence after Jennifer's passing. I spoke of the guilt I carried for not being the father Tyler deserved, for missing soccer games and school plays because I was closing deals halfway around the world. In turn, Elena revealed her own journey, growing up in Washington Heights as the daughter of immigrants, her father from Puerto Rico, her mother from the Dominican Republic, navigating the elite academic world of Columbia University, and ultimately finding her calling as an art teacher rather than pursuing the more lucrative career in gallery management that her professors had pushed her toward. "Teaching isn't what my family expected," she explained. "My mother still doesn't quite understand why I chose Browning over a position at Christie's. But watching students discover their own creative voices, there's nothing like it." "You must be good at it," I said. "Tyler never showed much interest in art before this year." She smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "He has talent. More importantly, he has something to say. His work is full of emotions he doesn't seem to express otherwise." The implication was clear. My son was working through his feelings about his mother's death, about my emotional distance, about growing up in the shadow of wealth and loss. "I'd like to see his work sometime," I said. "Parent-teacher conferences are in 3 weeks," Elena replied. "But I could show you his portfolio sooner if you'd like." Our conversation continued as the afternoon light faded and the garden lamps flickered on. We discovered shared tastes in music, not just jazz, but classical as well, a mutual love for Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novels, and the same favorite spot in Central Park, the Shakespeare Garden, away from the typical tourist paths. Every moment of that confrontation with my past was both a battle and a liberation. I realized that the woman before me was not just Tyler's teacher or a potential romantic interest, but a mirror reflecting my deepest vulnerabilities. It was a poignant moment of reconciliation with my true self, one that demanded honesty and the courage to embrace the unpredictable future that awaited. "Would you like to get dinner?" I asked finally, as the museum's closing announcement echoed through the garden. "There's a small Italian place around the corner, nothing fancy, but the pasta is authentic." Elena hesitated, and for a moment I feared I'd misread the situation entirely. "I'd like that," she said at last. "But Daniel, I need to be clear about something. I'm Tyler's teacher first. Whatever happens between us has to take that into consideration." Of course, I agreed immediately. Professional boundaries are important. "And I'm not looking for a whirlwind romance with a billionaire," she continued, a hint of steel beneath her gentle tone. "That's not who I am." "What are you looking for?" I asked, genuinely curious. She thought for a moment, her eyes meeting mine with unflinching directness. "Connection. Conversation. The chance to get to know someone who interests me, without pressure or expectations." In that shared space of vulnerability, I discovered that the power of truth was far greater than the shadows of hidden secrets. For the first time in years, I felt seen not as Daniel Peterson the CEO, nor as a philanthropic donor or eligible widower, but simply as myself, a man with flaws and fears and the capacity for growth. "I think I can manage that," I said, offering my hand to help her from the bench. As we walked through the museum toward the exit, our hands brushed occasionally, neither of us quite ready to reach for the other, but both aware of the possibility that hung in the air between us. The weeks following that evening at the museum unfolded in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Elena and I began seeing each other cautiously, dinners at out-of-the-way restaurants where we wouldn't encounter Browning parents or faculty, Sunday afternoon walks in the Brooklyn Botanic Garden, a jazz performance at a small club in the village where we sat in a dark corner, her hand occasionally brushing against mine as we listened to the quartet on stage. Each meeting revealed new layers of her personality, her passion for art education reform, her volunteer work teaching watercolor classes at a senior center in Washington Heights, her surprisingly competitive nature when we played chess in Washington Square Park. She beat me soundly twice before I managed a draw. I found myself thinking about her at unexpected moments during board meetings while reviewing quarterly projections in the quiet moments before sleep. But the most significant transformation wasn't in my romantic life, it was in my relationship with Tyler. I began making fundamental changes to my schedule, blocking off sacred time for his soccer games and art exhibitions. I hired a new COO, promoting Richard Barnes and giving him real authority to make decisions in my absence. The Wall Street Journal ran a piece questioning whether Peterson Global Ventures was preparing for a leadership transition, sending our stock down temporarily until I clarified my continued commitment to the company in a terse statement. The truth was simpler and more complex. I was reordering my priorities for the first time since Jennifer's death. One evening in late November, Tyler asked if he could invite Elena to our traditional Thanksgiving dinner, a catered affair in my penthouse that typically included only the two of us and occasionally my sister's family from Boston. "Are you sure that's what you want?" I asked carefully. "It won't be weird for you to have your teacher there?" Tyler looked at me with an expression that perfectly blended teenage exasperation with genuine affection. "Dad, I know you guys are dating." "It's fine. Actually, it's better than fine. You seem, I don't know, more like yourself lately." "More like myself?" I repeated, puzzled by his phrasing. "Yeah," he said, suddenly fascinated by the pattern on his socks. "More like how Mom used to describe you in her stories. Less like CEO Robot Dad." I felt a lump form in my throat. "Your mother told you stories about me?" Tyler nodded, still not meeting my eyes. "When you were traveling a lot, before she got sick. She'd tell me about how you guys met, how you used to sneak her into fancy hotel pools in the summer, how you'd leave her notes written in book margins." He finally looked up. "She said you were always laughing back then." The revelation hit me with unexpected force. Jennifer had preserved that version of me for our son, even as I was becoming someone else, someone harder, more driven, less present. She'd given Tyler a picture of his father that I hadn't lived up to for years. "I'd like to be that person again," I said quietly. "You kind of are, sometimes," Tyler replied with a shrug. "Especially around Ms. Ramirez." He paused, then added, "So can I invite her or what?" Thanksgiving with Elena added a dimension to our small family gathering that I hadn't realized was missing. She arrived with homemade flan, her grandmother's recipe, she explained, and an easy warmth that complemented the formal elegance of my penthouse. She drew Tyler out about his art projects and soccer team, listened attentively to my sister Martha's stories about her surgical practice, and charmed my brother-in-law with her knowledge of obscure jazz musicians from the 1950s. As we sat around the dining table with its panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline, I found myself watching the interactions with a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. This, I realized, was what Jennifer would have wanted for us, not just material comfort, but genuine connection and joy. Later that evening, after Tyler had retreated to his room to video chat with friends and Martha and her husband had returned to their hotel, Elena and I stood on the terrace, the November air crisp, but not yet biting. "Thank you for today," I said, watching the lights of the city twinkle below us. It's been a long time since this place felt like a home rather than just somewhere I live. Elena studied me for a moment, her dark eyes reflective in the soft glow from the penthouse windows. "You've been changing, Daniel." "I see it. Tyler sees it." "For the better, I hope," I replied. "Definitely for the better." She stepped closer, her shoulder brushing against mine. "You're letting people in again." I took a deep breath, gathering courage for what I needed to say. "There's something I want you to know. Something I haven't talked about with anyone." Elena waited silently, giving me space to continue. "When Jennifer died, I made a decision, conscious or not, to become someone else. Someone who wouldn't feel the pain of that loss so acutely. I thought if I focused entirely on work, on measurable achievements, I could avoid dealing with the grief." I paused, struggling to articulate feelings I'd suppressed for years. I think I was afraid that if I let myself feel the full weight of losing her, I'd never recover. So I became this other version of myself. Successful, yes, but hollow. "And now?" Elena asked softly. "Now I'm trying to find my way back to who I was, or maybe to who I can be now, after everything that's happened." I turned to face her fully. "You've been a part of that, whether you intended to be or not." She smiled, reaching out to take my hand. "I think that's how it works sometimes. The right people come into our lives when we're finally ready for them." In the aftermath of that life-altering Thanksgiving, I found a renewed sense of purpose that transcended the material world I had once dominated. My perspective shifted dramatically as I began to view my relationships, especially with Tyler, with newfound clarity. I recognized that the complexities of our lives were not burdens to be hidden, but bridges to understanding and growth. The next month brought the school's winter art exhibition, where Tyler's work, a series of mixed media pieces exploring memory and loss, was prominently featured. I stood before his central piece, a collage incorporating fragments of Jennifer's handwriting from old letters, feeling both proud and humbled by his emotional intelligence. "It's beautiful," Elena said quietly, joining me in front of the display. "He's processing his grief through art in ways he couldn't otherwise express." "I should have seen it sooner," I replied, guilt settling heavily on my shoulders. "You're seeing it now," she countered, her hand finding mine discreetly. "That's what matters." I took the brave step of opening up to Tyler that night, sharing the truths of my past and the lessons learned from the hidden confessions that had nearly derailed my existence. His innocent remark about me being rich and single, once a source of shock and revelation, had transformed into a catalyst for healing and transformation. In our honest conversations, we discovered that vulnerability could be the foundation of a stronger, more authentic bond. "I miss her too, you know," Tyler said as we sat in his room, surrounded by the evidence of his emerging identity, soccer trophies, art supplies, vintage jazz posters I'd helped him find. "But I don't think she'd want us to stop living because she couldn't be here." The wisdom in his words, so reminiscent of Jennifer's practical compassion, brought tears to my eyes. "When did you get so smart?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shrugged. A small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Must be genetics. The winter passed in a blur of holiday celebrations, school events, and quiet evenings with Elena. By Valentine's Day, we had settled into a relationship that felt both exciting and comfortable, new yet somehow familiar, as if we'd known each other in another life. You know, Elena said as we walked through a snow-covered Central Park on a crisp February morning, I never expected to fall for one of my students' parents. It's terribly cliché. I laughed, pulling her closer as we navigated an icy patch on the path. And I never expected to be set up by my teenage son. Life takes unexpected turns. Speaking of unexpected, she said, her tone shifting slightly, I've been offered a position as Director of Education at the Whitney. It would start in the fall. I stopped walking, turning to face her. Elena, that's incredible. Are you going to take it? I'm considering it, she replied carefully. It would mean I wouldn't be Tyler's teacher anymore. The implication was clear. One potential complication in our relationship would be removed. I think you should take it if it's what you want, I said honestly. Tyler will understand. And selfishly, I'd be happy not to have to sneak around quite so much. She smiled, her eyes bright in the winter sunlight. There's something else. The position comes with an apartment in the museum's building. It's small, but are you planning to leave me already? I teased, though a flicker of genuine concern passed through me. Actually, I was thinking it might be a good place for me to keep some things, while spending more time here. She gestured vaguely in the direction of my penthouse. If that's something you might want. I felt a surge of joy mixed with a familiar trace of fear. Moving forward with Elena meant fully embracing a future different from the one I'd planned with Jennifer. Yet standing there in the snow, looking into Elena's hopeful expression, I knew with certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. I'd like that very much, I said, pulling her close for a kiss that promised new beginnings. As I stand at the threshold of this new chapter, I realize that life's twists and turns, though painful and unpredictable, are the very things that make it worth living. I have learned that embracing the totality of one's past is not a sign of weakness, but rather the cornerstone of personal growth. The journey ahead is uncertain, but I face it with courage, determination, and an unwavering commitment to living a life defined not by secrets or regrets, but by truth and love. Jennifer will always be a part of who I am, a cornerstone of the family Tyler and I share. But Elena has shown me that the heart has an infinite capacity for love, not replacing what was lost, but building something new alongside cherished memories. Last week, as spring began to emerge in tentative green shoots and early blossoms throughout the city, Tyler came home from school with news of his own. I got accepted to that summer art program at RISD, he announced over dinner, trying to sound casual despite the excitement practically vibrating through him. That's fantastic, I exclaimed, genuinely proud. Your portfolio must have impressed them. Miss Chin helped a lot, he said, referring to the teacher who had taken over some of Elena's classes as she prepared for her transition to the Whitney. But yeah, they said my work showed emotional maturity and technical promise. Elena reached across the table to squeeze his hand. They're right. You found your voice this year. Tyler looked between us, his expression suddenly serious. I was thinking, maybe this summer, before the program starts, we could visit Mom's hometown in Massachusetts? I don't really remember it, but I'd like to see where she grew up. The request caught me off guard. In all the years since Jennifer's death, I'd avoided her hometown of Concord, too afraid of the memories it would evoke. But looking at my son's hopeful face, I knew it was time to stop running from those parts of our past. I think that's a wonderful idea, I said. We could make a road trip of it. Show Elena some of New England. I'd like that, Elena said softly, her eyes meeting mine with understanding. That night, as the three of us planned our summer journey on my laptop, looking up bed and breakfasts in Concord and attractions along the route, I felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over me. My life had taken a course I could never have predicted that day when Tyler accidentally called me and announced I was rich and single. Rich, yes, but not just in financial terms. Rich in connections, in possibilities, in second chances. And single? Not anymore. not in any of the ways that truly matter.